Consider two countries, right? And they can both produce two goods, right? So the two countries are India and China, and the two goods they can produce are gold and silk, right? So over on the left, we have India and their production possibility frontier. And notice that if they were to focus all their resources on producing gold, then they can produce up to 2 tons of gold or 5 tons of silk. Meanwhile, in China, they can produce up to 3 tons of gold or 6 tons of silk, right? So knowing this information, we can think about who has a comparative advantage, who has an absolute advantage in which goods, and whether or not these two countries could possibly trade from each other and get gains from trade, right? So looking at this, we can see initially right off the bat that China can produce more. Let's assume that this is amounts per worker, right? So more gold per worker and silk per worker, right? They can produce 3 tons of gold per worker or 6 tons of silk per worker versus India's 2 tons of gold per worker or 5 tons of silk per worker, right? So China can produce more of both types of goods per worker. That means that China has an absolute advantage in both goods, right? They can produce more gold, so more gold per worker than India, so they have an absolute advantage in gold, and they can produce more silk per worker than India. So that means that China has an absolute advantage in both, right? So China has absolute advantage in both gold and silk, right? Okay, so that's one thing that we figured out. China has an absolute advantage in gold and silk, which means that India doesn't have an absolute advantage in anything. All right. Now let's think about comparative advantage. Do any of these countries have a comparative advantage in any of these goods? Right. And remember, comparative advantage has to do with calculating opportunity costs, and you have a comparative advantage in a good for which you have the lowest opportunity costs, right? So let's think about this, right? And remember, if we want to calculate opportunity costs from production possibility frontiers, then that means that we're going to want to calculate the slopes of those production possibility frontiers, right? So let's think about India, right? So notice over here, we've got their production possibility frontier, and the slope here imagine going from one intercept to another, you can see that the rise is -5 and the run is +2 tons of gold, right? So it's a -5, -5 silk, right? Tons of silk. I'm just going to write silk for shorthand, divided by 2 gold, right? The rise is a -5 silk, and the run is a +2 gold, going from one intercept on the production possibility frontier to the other, right? So that means that the opportunity cost of the good on the horizontal axis, which happens to be gold, the way that I've drawn it, we could have drawn it another way, right? We could have flipped the axes. But the opportunity cost of gold is the absolute value of that slope, right? And silk per gold, right? So the opportunity cost of gold is 5/2, or 2.5 silk per gold, right? Okay, and then from this, we can figure out that the opportunity cost of silk is just going to be the reciprocal, right? So it's just going to be 2/5 of a ton of gold per ton. I'll just write per silk, right? We know that we're talking about tons, but we're just writing in shorthand, right? Okay, so those are the opportunity costs in India, right? It costs them 5/2 tons of silk per ton of gold, or 2/5 of a ton of gold per ton of silk, right? Those are their opportunity costs in India. Let's figure out the analogous opportunity costs in China, right? So here in China, the slope here happens to be, it's going to be -6, right? -6 over +3. And keeping track of the units, the -6 is silk, tons of silk, divided by tons of gold. So this is, you can think of this as just 2 silk per gold, right? Because 6 divided by 3 is 2. So it's -2 silk per gold, right? Which means that this, taking the absolute value of the -2, is just going to be 2 silk per gold, or in terms of the opportunity cost of silk, 1/2 of a ton of gold per ton of silk. Right? That's the opportunity cost of silk in China, right? Now, in order to figure out who has a comparative advantage in which good, you want to find who has the lowest opportunity cost, right? Now let's think about gold. Who has the lowest opportunity cost for gold? India or China? Does anybody have a lowest? Well, 5 over 2, that's 2.5, right? 2.5. 2.5 is greater than 2. So that means that, let me get another color here real fast. That means that China has the lowest opportunity cost for gold, right? So let's go ahead and circle that to indicate that this is the lowest opportunity cost for gold. Circle that in green so it stands out. So that tells us actually that China has a comparative advantage. China has comparative advantage in gold, right? So China has a comparative advantage in gold. Now let's see if anybody has a comparative advantage in silk, right? So for silk, notice that the opportunity cost in India is 2/5, which is 0.4, right? So that's the opportunity cost of silk in India, whereas the opportunity cost of silk in China is 1/2 of a ton of gold per ton of silk, right? So the 2/5 is less than the 1/2. So it looks like actually India has a comparative advantage in silk, right? So this implies, since it's lower, that India has, I'll just write CA for comparative advantage this time, in silk, right? So one of the things to notice here is that it's possible for a country that has no absolute advantage to have a comparative advantage, right? India doesn't have an absolute advantage in either of these goods. China has an absolute advantage in both gold and silk because they can produce more tons of gold or tons of silk per worker than India can, right? Nonetheless, India happens to have a comparative advantage in silk, right? And meanwhile, of course, China also has a comparative advantage in gold, right? So China has a comparative advantage in gold. India has a comparative advantage in silk. And so according to the theory of comparative advantage, this means that China should specialize in producing gold, and India should specialize in producing silk, and then they can trade from each other and realize gains from trade and be above their and enjoy quantities above their production possibility frontier by doing that. Right? Okay, thank you for watching.